China, The Long March. Chapter 4. Mao takes over. The conference at Zunyi in January 1935 brought the great change in leadership everyone had been expecting. Mao Zedong assumed the top position in the party, which he would retain until his death in 1976. He was not called chairman at Zunyi. He simply joined the standing committee of the Politburo, with responsibility for military affairs. But from now on, no one doubted his authority. This visionary farmer's son, who led peasants and wrote poetry, won out over the Western Comintern agent and his supporters. The immediate subject of debate at Zunyi was military strategy and survival. How to stop the disastrous losses the Red Army had suffered during and since the last encirclement campaign down in Jiangxi. What to tell the political officers, what rallying slogans to give the troops, how to strengthen their fighting spirit. An army of 80,000 fighting men had been eroded down to 35,000. Those left were a lean, hard core of experienced fighters, but they were not superhuman. If morale was to be preserved, command must be transferred to other hands. Why should Party Secretary Borgu, just because he had been Moscow trained, be giving orders to senior officers who had borne the heat and burden of countless fights, when he had never led troops in battle before he came to Jiangxi? Li De, the German advisor, had prevailed over men like Mao, Zhu De, and Peng Dehuai. And what was there to show for it but scores of thousands of dead and wounded? Supporters of Li De were reluctant to call a conference at all. They had been discussing the situation only a few weeks before at Liping. Mao insisted, and on the grounds that crucial military questions would be discussed, he saw to it that senior military leaders were included, even though they were not Politburo members. This helped secure him majority support at the Zunyi conference. So Mao had his way. Borgu and Li De were downgraded, and Zhou Enlai frankly admitted to having backed the wrong policies. Mao's was now the decisive voice within the Politburo. Zhou Enlai would from now on be his able and dedicated top staff officer, sharing military command with Zhu De. Supporting Mao were many who would fill positions of power when the People's Republic came into being in October 1949. Among them, young Deng Xiaoping, former organizer of students in France and peasant armies in China, and editor of the army's newspaper, Red Star. Decades later, he would succeed Mao as leader of the Chinese people. Zunyi marked the point when the Comintern, and thereby Moscow's influence on events in China, was greatly diminished. Moscow's role as leader of world communism remained unchallenged, and emissaries of China's Communist Party were sent to Moscow to inform authorities there of developments at Zunyi. But communications between China and the Soviet Union were extremely difficult, and with the Red Army now retreating deep into China's interior, it was knowledge of men and the countryside, rather than politics, that best answered the grim needs of survival. The conference also adopted the slogan, "Go north to fight the Japanese." Already the party had been calling for a united front to resist Japanese invasion, which had begun in 1931 with the occupation of Manchuria, followed by more encroachment, which would finally lead to the long and disastrous Sino-Japanese War. This communist appeal for a united form of resistance would prove decisive in furthering the party's fortunes. It was an appeal to deep patriotic feelings, and a growing response came from Chinese of every sort, regardless of politics. They simply felt that the communists were the strongest anti-Japanese force operating in China. From Zunyi onwards, the aim of the Long March was a link-up with Zhang Guotao somewhere in North Sichuan. This meant crossing the great Yangtze River, a barrier to daunt the most determined of army commanders. The Kuomintang forces were not just entrenched on the other side, they were all around Zunyi by now, steadily closing in. Chiang Kai-shek had come down from the north and was in Chongqing directing operations. The communists needed to confuse the Kuomintang forces, and in this kind of strategy, the communists were now becoming masters. It was hard on the rank and file, for weeks were spent marching and counter-marching until the enemy was deceived and shaken off. The Red Army Command would make a sudden thrust in one direction, and then, after Kuomintang troops had been concentrated to stop them, move the main body elsewhere. 4 times they crossed the Qishui River that flows north into the Yangtze. They occupied small towns near the Sichuan border. They took the town of Maotai, where the famous Chinese spirit of that name is distilled. It resembles aquavit, and people say the soldiers thought at first that the colourless fluid in the great storehouse jars was water, and washed their weary feet in it. After the second crossing of the Qishui, the communists took the strategic Loshan Pass and reoccupied Zunyi, and in the course of the fighting routed 2 divisions of Kuomintang troops. It was their first major victory since the start of the Long March 4 months earlier. Hand-to-hand fighting decided the issue. Begin quote. "We cut them down with broadswords and hand grenades," end quote, said a Red Army political officer. Begin quote. The main body fled south. Most of them were wiped out. They had destroyed a pontoon across the Wu River, leaving 1,000 of their own troops cut off. End quote. The victory gave a much-needed boost to Red Army morale. The Yangtze still had to be crossed. It was April 1935, and the Red Army was still in Guizhou, evading the Kuomintang forces. Chiang Kai-shek was in Guiyang, the provincial capital, checking that defences along the Yangtze River were strong and prepared. Then, a faint communist attack on Guiyang caused Chiang hastily to summon troops from the west to defend his headquarters. This opened an escape route to the west and gave the communists their chance to break out of threatened encirclement. It meant grueling days of marching, but in this region, along the borders of Guizhou and Sichuan provinces, the communists were getting help from peasants in the villages and workers in the towns. New recruits were joining the march, including women guerrillas who carried ammunition, cared for the sick, and repaired clothing. Early in 1935 came a shattering setback, though the communists only learned of it later. The Fourth Front Army, with which the main force planned to link up, had retreated into the high plateau and mountain valleys of Xikang in the remote northwest of Sichuan province. A further message reported that it was establishing a base area around the town of Songpan. This meant that it was much too far away to be of any help to the main force, the First Front Army, in crossing the Yangtze River. However, failure to cross the Yangtze would mean tighter encirclement and catastrophe. After further maneuvers to mislead the enemy, the communists moved west again. One battalion drew off the Kuomintang divisions by pretending to threaten Kunming, capital city of Yunnan province. Meanwhile, the mass of the Red Army made for the upper reaches of the Yangtze, where the river bears the name Golden Sands and thunders down through deep ravines. Here there were no bridges, and ferries were few and primitive. Chiang Kai-shek was confident that his enemies could not cross. But by now, the Red Army troops were masters of the unexpected. One battalion covered 85 miles in a day and a night of forced marching to reach the ferry town of Jiaopingdu, far upriver. They entered the place at midnight without exciting attention and disarmed the garrison. All the ferry boats had been withdrawn to the far bank, but the communists took a village official down to the river and made him call out to the guards on the opposite side that a government detachment had arrived and needed transport. A boat was duly sent across. It returned manned by Red Army soldiers, who surprised the defenders playing mahjong and seized their stacked arms. The main forces of the Red Army were swinging north in the wake of the vanguard, and by noon of the following day, the 7th of May, 1935, they too were in the ferry staging area at Jiaopingdu, where they found 6 large boats. They crossed in 9 days, according to the accepted account, without the loss of a single man. When the army had crossed, the boats were destroyed, and the troops pushed on northwards. It was 4 days before pursuing Kuomintang forces reached the Golden Sands River, to be taunted with shouts from the rear guard on the far bank. Quote, "Come over! Try a swim! The water's fine!" End quote, according to some accounts. Others say that pursuers met no one and found nothing, save the detritus of 30,000 marchers, torn fragments of paper, vegetable husks, broken sandals. The Red Army had shaken off its pursuers, but Chiang Kai-shek still hoped to seal his enemy's escape route at one more strategically important river. This was the Dadu, famous in Chinese legend and history. On its banks, heroes of the ancient romance, the Three Kingdoms, had met their deaths 1,700 years before. Only 100 years before, the last survivors of the once victorious army of the Taiping Rebellion, led by Prince Shi Da-kai, had been destroyed by troops of the ruling Manchu emperor. General Shi had surrendered, only to be tortured and killed. Chiang Kai-shek wired his warlord allies in Sichuan and his own generals, urging them to repeat the history of victory over the Taipings by wiping out the communists at the Dadu River crossings. But the communists also knew Chinese history and remembered well why the rebel leader had been defeated. Shi Da-kai had paused for 3 days when he reached the river to celebrate the birth of a son. Those 3 days' delay had given his enemy the chance to concentrate forces and cut off his line of retreat. As soon as he realized his mistake, Shi had tried to break through the trap, but he was caught on the river's narrow gorges. The communists did not intend to repeat Shi Dakai's error. No delays for rest or regrouping. They must press on. Some of the younger commanders began to murmur. Forced marching often meant large numbers of men dropping out, with the certainty of being shot when the enemy caught up with them. There was a limit to the endurance of even the toughest. The dissenters are said to have been overruled at a quick Politburo meeting outside the town of Huili. The race for the Dadu was on, even though the river still lay hundreds of miles to the north, beyond mountains and forests inhabited by minority groups, with a deep dislike of strangers, especially ethnic Chinese. These people were the Yis, a tough and warlike tribe active in this western part of Sichuan province for hundreds of years. Chinese officials and armed forces seeking to penetrate the region had been driven out or killed. However, the communists, unlike their Kuomintang opponents, had declared a policy of friendship towards all China's minority groups. These were, and still are today, more than 55 of these groups, making up less than 8% of the total population, but occupying more than half China's territory, mostly remote areas. The Red Army had already made contact with some of them, the Miao tribes in Guizhou and Yunnan provinces, where they were able to convince these people that they were merely passing through. With no aim of stealing land or goods, relations were cordial. Gifts were exchanged, and the Red Army even won recruits. The same approach was tried with the Yis in Sichuan. The Red Army captured towns on the Yi country's borders and set free a number of Yi chieftains who had been imprisoned by the provincial administration. These freed prisoners went forward with Red Army units and spoke on their behalf to distrustful tribespeople. The task of fixing an alliance with the Yis was entrusted to Liu Bocheng, a Red Army commander who spoke the local language. He urged them to join with the communists in fighting the Kuomintang. The Yi chiefs asked for weapons. To their surprise and delight, the communists at once agreed. In a solemn ceremony of brotherhood, Liu Bocheng joined the Yi high chieftain in drinking a toast in blood from a freshly killed cockerel. The Yi tribesmen proved good friends. They guided the Red Army troops through deep forests, which hid them from air reconnaissance, and over mountain trails unknown to strangers. The marchers pushed on rapidly, and by late May 1935, they were looking down from the heights to a turbulent river far below. They knew it to be the Dadu. The village here was Anshunchang. It looked a very unpromising place for an army's river crossing. Even so, the communists felt that luck was with them. For some unknown reason, a ferry boat had been left moored on their side of the fast-flowing waters.